I apologize for still having kind of a corporate slide deck. I promise that it's my research and it's not salesy, but Eric Smith and I decided it was a good idea once I got in at midnight last night to not go to bed till 4 a.m. and go to the local gas station next to American Inn and order one of everything on the menu. So I didn't have a chance to switch it to the Hacker Black background. And also, my infusion pump that I was going to do a live demo with got confiscated by TSA yesterday. They felt that I didn't have the appropriate prescription for it, and they were probably right. But anyways, we got some good stuff for you. So now this thing isn't working. All right, there we go. So who am I? Scott Erven. I'm currently Associate Director, Medical Device Healthcare Security. Is there anybody local area that works in healthcare? All right, there's a couple folks here. That's good. Anybody go to the hospital? All right, so we all have something in common. Good. So I spent just over 15 years IT information security. Previous to being at Protiviti, I was in healthcare for over 5 years. So I do have direct experience in healthcare managing security teams. So I don't just come at this from a security researcher perspective. I also understand the industry fairly well. Spent the last 3 years researching medical devices. There's my Twitter handle. If you want to follow me, I tend to send stuff on medical devices and Dave Kennedy. So first off, what's that?
I already sent 4 to you.
Yeah. So why research medical devices? Why was it important to me? Why did I get into it? For me, it was always, working at a healthcare organization was rewarding. It was, a nonprofit atmosphere. It was helping, physicians and caregivers directly give back to the patients. But I always felt like I never had a direct impact on the organization's mission and values as it relates to patient safety. As I started seeing medical devices over the years, throwing network connectivity into them, and started realizing poor security by design in these devices, that's when I noticed, hey, as a security person, I could really have a direct impact on, patient safety by identifying vulnerabilities in these devices, that are, network vulnerabilities, those types of things, working with the manufacturer, working with the federal government, DHS, ICS, CERT's been really good, FDA as well, and really work through that process and have a direct impact, on patient safety and those types of things. So that's why I do it, not just because I'm a security researcher and want to pick on medical device security that's really far behind. The other thing is, equipping defenders inside these organizations to get them information about exposure there and, provide some, recommendations on how we can go about starting to fix, these solutions. So the second thing is, this was up top here, this was the FBI. The FBI had typically not been involved in medical device security if you followed it. DHS, ICS, CERT, as well as the FDA kind of were the initial starting points. Well, last April, the FBI actually set out 2 what are called PINs, which are private industry notices that only go to industry. I'm not just showing this once it ends up on Google, it's public domain, so I can share it with everybody. But one of the things that pointed out was, the biggest vulnerability was a perception of IT healthcare professionals that their current perimeter defenses were working when clearly the data states otherwise. So that's a pretty big wake-up call from a federal agency saying how you see yourselves in reality is completely wrong. And it goes to like Tyler's slide of segment all the things. You'll see that that's not the case as I show you some of these slides. And physicians and the public are generally unaware of the risks. Just want to give you an idea of, just so you know, all of this was disclosed with DHS, ICS, CERT. So here's some of the timelines starting last year when I did the disclosure for this stuff. Some of the examples in here were actually 0 days that we dropped at DefCon because the manufacturer wouldn't respond. But outside of that, everything's been reported through responsible disclosure. So what's the bad news? I'm going to show you, the first part of my research really focused on device-specific vulnerabilities. So I spent 2 years of my life, and ultimately after 2 years, what I found out was that basic security hygiene was missing in these devices. So I spent 2 years finding out that, okay, they use weak hard-coded passwords, They don't use encryption, and they aren't being updated or patched. And the second phase I'm going to talk about is direct internet-facing exposure that I'm going to show you today. So what was the bad news with that, right? Significant risk, patient safety, direct medical device exposure, direct from the internet. Use a tool. Who knows what Shodan is? There's quite a few of you. So John Matherly actually worked with us, and he did some custom searches with us on Shodan to get some of this data. But what I'm going to show you today is actually not one of those custom searches. It's just a publicly available search. But Shodan is a website that goes out. It's kind of like mass scan, and it scans the entire internet, and it's kind of like a Google search for network infrastructure for all the internet-facing IP systems. Returns banner information, header information, those types of things, so that you can look at specific devices and identify them. So within a half hour, actually under an hour, I located this stuff and this external exposure that I'm going to show. And I think it really goes to show healthcare. Once we started sharing our research with the folks over at DHS, they'll tell you that they even believe healthcare is 10, maybe even closer to 15 years behind when it comes to security from financial and retail sector. They're even further behind than like industrial controls and SCADA systems. So what's the good news? Well, a healthcare organization can also use Shodan or these types of tools. They are open source tools to find vulnerabilities, but they need to know you have to actually use the tool in order to find that. And the stuff that I'm going to show you here is actually a misconfiguration, and it can really be remediated just by shutting a service down. So when we went into Shodan, I was working with the other researcher, Sean Merdinger, and we did about an hour and a half long talk at DefCon if you want to look up some of the more technical details on that last year. But we wanted to do direct internet-facing devices, and so we were going through Shodan and we were throwing some keywords in. I put in anesthesia into the search engine. After I put in anesthesia, I got a hit. And I looked at it, and I fairly quickly I knew, like, hey, this isn't an anesthesia cart, inside of an OR or inside of a workroom, anything like that. And the only indication that it was even a medical device is that it was still running Windows XP. But other than that, I knew it wasn't a medical device. And what had actually happened is there was an external-facing system that had SMB open, both external-facing, all the way internal, had anonymous read to AD, and gave us all this intelligence about all this healthcare organization's internal infrastructure and all their medical devices. So this is the first healthcare organization that I stumbled upon. Real large healthcare organization, which I've worked through them as well and their incident response and all of that, but very large healthcare organization. They had over 12,000 employees, 3,000 physicians, and you'll see some of the data I show you here. They had very large cardiovascular and neuroscience institutions attached. Exposed intelligence in almost 70,000 systems when we dumped the data. So this wasn't just medical devices. This was their entire network. So I'm showing you medical devices because that was the focus of my research, but it was everything. I mean, domain controllers, financial systems, all their medical records. I probably have a medical record example in here, but it was everything that we had access to. It also exposed third-party connections. So we see indicators in there of systems that were associated with third-party organizations that do radiology reads, or, for example, that do laboratory services, those types of things. So did we find only one? So that's the one we came across that was pretty big. Well, we changed our Shodan query, and we said, okay, is this an isolated incident, or is this kind of a massive problem? And so what we did, you can see the search query, or at least part of it up top here, how we did that in Shodan, and we're looking at SMB, and we just changed the org, and so we did keywords, so health, clinic, hospital, medical, and then return the values inside of the org name so that we could identify how many were affected. And we came up with, you'll see here, is hundreds. But when we changed that search term to specialty type things, so if we put in podiatry, pediatric, urology, those types of things, we ended up with thousands of healthcare organizations that had this misconfiguration that resulted in exposure to medical devices that I'll show you some specific examples of. Here's just some quick heat maps out of Shodan for how that lays out for the different search terms. It's really bad in the US. I'm sure part of that is I don't know the Chinese characters to query showdown for health. But they do actually start coming up here at the end in medical. So maybe that's a Chinese word, I don't know. So who cares about SMB, right? Big deal. A healthcare organization had SMB open, like that's not a big deal. Well, it's really when you start to chain these things together that it becomes some serious exposure. So here's the screenshot of this. So it is SMB, and who knows MSO 8067? Well, you kids are young, you probably don't. Yeah, the red team will be using it on you this afternoon because it still works great. So anyways, that's the exploit or the vulnerability that configure exploited. So all the way back in 2008, XP Service Pack 2, that's what was on this system. Well, by default, what protocol does it run over? Well, it's also over SMB, which we now know is open. So why does the info matter that I'm going to show you? You'll see it's a gold mine for attackers. It's treasure trove of information on these systems. It shows, in many cases, the office location, floor number, office number, whether the medical device or the supporting system that it's talking to has system timeout exemptions, those types of things. Associated physician names, all of that. So here we go. Here's some examples. So just to give you an idea here of what these screenshots are. So over on the far left of all of these screenshots, these are scrubbed out, but that's the actual workstation name on the internal network of the system. And then you'll see all the information that's being populated for us to the right of that. And so you can see some of these examples. And the one on the left, this is systems that we found where the screen lock was set to 0, which meant the timeout wouldn't kick in on that system. So we know that we could walk up to that system and we would have access. So this is pretty typical. You see the examples here. They're like OR, the operating rooms, that they don't set timeouts on there because they're all scrubbed up and they don't want to be fumbling around. So that's pretty typical. I mean, there's some physical security in those types of settings, but some of these others, there's definitely not. Did I lose it? Sorry. The other on the right is examples of medical record. So in this case, the organization happened to use Epic. Know that this isn't a vendor problem. This is the healthcare organization's issue. It's their misconfiguration of their external perimeter. But if you know anything about Epic, some of these things to point out here, like down here at the bottom, like Epic MyChart. Epic MyChart is what you, as a patient, would use to connect remotely into the Epic system to view all your stuff. So that's their MyChart server. So I would know how to attack it. I now have a direct path to attack it and pivot. Up top, like business object servers, those are actually used in the Epic environment for reporting. So there's going to be a treasure trove of patient information sitting in that server. So as an attacker, this is really good information if they want to go do financial crime, those types of things. They can go directly at that system because they know where they sit on your network. Let's get into some more interesting stuff. So here up top, here's MRI systems, here's CT scanner systems. You can also see those have screen lock exemptions. Down below, those are telemetry. Telemetry systems, there's a couple things. Defibrillators and that type of stuff do run form of telemetry like on radio frequency of like 400K, but those are like near field communication type systems. But infant abduction or like adult wandering systems, those will typically run on telemetry. So for instance, if you put the band on the infant and they walk out the door, then the alarm will go off or the doors will lock, that type of thing. So here's some cardiology systems. So this top one here, this was actually the one that's highlighted in the top. That was actually a pacemaker controller that's used to program pacemakers and implantable defibs. And if you know anything about pacemaker controller systems, you know they do not use authorization. Any type of login to the controller system, and there's no type of authorization or username and password required in order to send configuration to the pacemaker. So you can reprogram pacemakers. There's no encryption. And for good reason. I mean, if you put encryption on an implantable defibrillator, then they're going to have to open your chest cavity every 6 months instead of every 3 years to replace that, and you're probably going to die from infection before Dave Kennedy comes after you. So there are clinical need or reasons why a lot of these things are done. It's just these unintended consequences that we haven't thought about. And In the bottom here, these are actually, this is where I got the hit for anesthesia, and this is why, is because it was some of the systems that were in here. So this bottom one says anesthesia workroom, right? Yeah, that's probably not an actual anesthesia cart. This one up top, anesthesia OR, is definitely the workstation that is attached to the cart. So if you know anything about OR environments, they don't just throw extra stuff into the OR. The anesthesia cart has a workstation attached directly to it. So this is an actual anesthesia cart inside of an OR. And in the middle there, that's actually pediatrics nuke imaging system. So we found a few devices, right? First, did we only find one organization? No, we found thousands. Well, did we just find one device? No, we didn't. So we took our favorite data analyst analysis tool, Microsoft Excel, and we dumped it all out, and that's where we came up with 68,000 systems that were affected, and then we used Excel to do Control F for keyword identifiers. So here's a summary of just that one organization of thousands that we found that had direct internet exposure and the types of systems associated. So you can see anesthesia, cardiology systems, like I said, they had a huge cardiology institution attached to this organization that was affected in this example. Infusion pumps, MRI, PACS systems. PACS systems really interesting. So PACS systems are used in the healthcare environment for image storage. So like CT scanners, X-rays, they all dump into PACS, and it's where all your images and some of your PHI sits in there. One thing is interesting when we were looking at these devices from a security and a vulnerability perspective is all but one of these devices didn't require authentication to get access to all of the images and all your PHI. So let me clarify that. When you went in under intended use through an application and retrieved an image, you had to have a user ID and a password to log into the PACS application to retrieve those images. But if you went to the actual remote storage, how all the manufacturers who'd installed it themselves and set it up implemented is it didn't have any NTFS permissioning on it, so you could just walk right in to the entire NAS storage and file storage device and grab all the information. In some cases, it did have NTFS permissioning, but what happened was inside the application, when you logged in as a user, you had to use unique login. But when you actually do the call to retrieve the remote image and embed it, it's using a hard-coded call with a hard-coded username and password that's in the service and technician manual and documentation that was easily located through Google searches. So this is one thing I think when it comes to like identity theft, those types of things, that attackers are probably using to get a lot of information, other than weak passwords on Epic servers or on medical record systems, and 31 systems that were associated with pacemaker controllers. So what are some attacks, right? What are some potential attacks that could be executed? So the least sexy, since Eric Smith isn't here yet, is the physical. Okay, the most sexy attack is the physical attack. So if we gave Eric, all of this information, he could use this, like he says, for pretexting. He knows specifically what floor, what office number. He knows what doctor it's associated with. He can use all that information. He knows that if he gets into that office, he's going to sit down. It doesn't have a screensaver timeout. Huge information, right, for a physical attack. Very easy to execute. You don't have to just go roaming around. You have a lot of background information. The other one, phishing. So phishing, this gets interesting. We can now send a phishing attack, and once we get access to that system, we can pivot directly. So we don't have to get a foothold and then start scanning to start identifying medical devices. We already have that information. So if we want to get into the network and we want to go after a CT scanner that we know has a vulnerability, boom, we can just go directly to that and start footprinting those. Finally, a pivot attack. This is no end user interaction required on these systems. They were XP vulnerable versions of 2003. Full, remote code execution on these boxes, and full pass through into the internal network. So, run the MS08067 SMB exploit, take control of it, go ahead and just pivot directly internal to those systems, go right after them. So adversary misconceptions, this is something I get a lot of, who's crazy enough to do this. It was interesting, the presentation that I spoke at yesterday was a big healthcare security and privacy event, and the CIO of Boston Children's spoke. And this was the first time that he spoke publicly. If you don't know, they were attacked by Anonymous about a year and a half ago, and had a big DDoS attack, had to take their entire network offline. And he actually said in his talk yesterday that he was one of these people that had a misconception, and he thought, why would anybody, this would never happen. Nobody would DDoS us. Nobody would attack a pediatric research hospital with, infants in there at their weakest moment. Well, it happened. But it doesn't take malicious intent either. So there are, nation states, there are, extremists, there is, hacktivism, those types of things. But there's also one thing that I missed during my research, and that was, patients themselves. So this was actually a story of, I did look at it through my hacker, eyes of malicious intent and what can be done if someone took time to do it. But I didn't look at that patient safety or the patient themselves causing, harm. And so this was two individuals that were in Austria, and they presented for treatment for gunshot wounds and like fragmentation wounds. And I was really pissed that the article didn't explain how they got gunshot and fragmentation wounds. But what they did say is after the patients presented, they were hooked up to an infusion pump and a PCA, which a PCA model infusion pump is actually like a patient-controlled administration clicker type infusion pump. And they felt their pain management wasn't under control and they weren't getting enough morphine. Well, the clinicians felt otherwise. So these two guys, they went on Google, they found service technician documentation, they found hard-coded credentials inside the infusion pump, hacked into the infusion pump, changed the upper limits on the infusion pump, and then built up a tolerance to morphine over the next couple of days, eventually having withdrawal symptoms once they tried taking them down. So that was something that's interesting to me is it doesn't necessarily take malicious intent. It's something that if security isn't designed during engineering can cause a patient safety, an adverse safety event or outcome. So it's maybe a more realistic attack model against a healthcare organization. It's probably a combined attack. It's not necessarily just going after healthcare for medical devices. You take something like Boston Marathon bombing, and you put that, and at the same time as the Boston Marathon bombing, you knock out power systems inside of like Boston Children's or those organizations. If you do that, that's probably the greatest threat that we have to look at that would have the most impact on patient safety. And does anyone know Ed Skudis? Sands guy? Yeah, these guys will know him. But he started out something called Cyber City. And so he basically took all this critical infrastructure and he set it up with Sands. And you come in and you have to, and it's everything. So it's like railroad and transportation, it's healthcare, it's the bank, it's the power utilities, all of that. Well, one thing when I was talking to Ed that he said is the healthcare and the hospital setup was the only environment that they actually had to harden so that it wasn't too easy to get into for the students initially. So that was kind of an eye-opener, but they're doing some stuff there with Cyber City on critical infrastructure. It's pretty interesting. So what can they do, right? Well, they really need to think like a hacker, these hospitals. They've historically been focused on HIPAA that I'll talk about. That's kind of led us astray into patient privacy, not patient safety. But yeah, use Shodan, look at those types of things. Use Metasploit or, you don't need to use Metasploit, but use a tool, do pen testing, check your perimeter, make sure it's hardened. This is an awesome picture. So I was in Minnesota. That is my uncle. So this is definitely, this guy's not getting hacked. I was living in Minnesota until November, and then I just moved out to to Los Angeles in November. So this was maybe a year and a half ago, and I was driving downtown, and I had to do a double take, and I had to go drive around the corner and do one of these with like my camera. But this is a guy with his infusion pump, and he had left the hospital, and so he had his infusion pump, and he was at the bar. So he isn't going to get hacked over Wi-Fi, because there probably isn't Wi-Fi at that dive bar. But if you notice in his hand, he's smoking, and behind his right leg there was actually a bottle of alcohol. So he's not going to get hacked, but the smoking and the drinking might kill him before that. So yeah, that was really surprising. He did have alcohol in the IV. That was it. So how did healthcare get here? It's not that. It's something that's new. I mean, I think a lot of people didn't really think about these threats, and manufacturers certainly, 10 years ago when they were designing, or 15 years ago when they were designing these products, weren't thinking of someone attacking them and, potentially causing harm, either intentionally or unintentionally. But because of HIPAA, a lot of healthcare organizations got their security funding due to HIPAA. Well, it's kind of created this, checkbox security of go down, do you have this policy, do you have this process, yes, 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 yes. It's very compliance focused, not security focused. So this is a new transition of really looking at it from patient safety instead of patient privacy, and something that they need to address. Policy, again, doesn't prevent adversarial risk, so you actually have to attack your network like a hacker would. So why do manufacturers have it? Well, one, they haven't had to design for it. Two, there's some challenges, like I talked about, like with implantables and those types of things. But the other is development life cycle and support life cycle. So if you take implantable device, so there was a new technology that just came out for a implantable defibrillator that actually went underarm, so they didn't have to open your chest cavity. So because of that, it was like game-changing technology, right? And so it got expedited approval from the FDA. Well, on expedited approval, can anybody guess how long it took from concept to actually market approval? Anybody? Nobody? 10 years, I hear? Yeah, pretty close. It was 13 years from concept to approval on an expedited FDA submission. And then they have to be able to support that device for however many more years. So that's kind of a challenge, is how do you support a device for 30 years? Or do you take the approach of, you know what, these things have a shelf life of 5 years, and you have to completely replace them, and you're just going to have to, take that cost burden on. So there's definitely some challenges there. They're also just building out information security teams. Some of them still don't even have them. Most of them don't even have true dedicated information security staff. GE, Philips, Medtronic, those folks do, but they've really been building those up over the last 2 years. And so things that have been in development for years, you can't embed security by design if you're not at the upfront of that product. So there's some inhibitors too that healthcare organizations kind of get some issues. I'm going to go into a case study here and get into more research, but I just wanted to touch on this. Is they've been told like they can't patch, they can't update the system, so that's why there's a lot of these XP systems. Well, for those of you in healthcare, that's not true. The FDA is like, they've put out a cybersecurity clause for years. I think since 2008. They reemphasized that in new guidance that they just put out in October. So they can patch it. The problem is healthcare organizations typically take the answer of we can't patch your device, and they don't go to the next step and say, oh, well, that's not what the FDA is telling me or giving me guidance on. Can you please fix this? Otherwise, we need to get on a call with the FDA. You start taking that approach as a healthcare organization, I can tell you it's very effective, and things start getting done. They've been told they can't change hard-coded passwords. So the reason the manufacturer tells them they can't change hard-coded passwords is, one, they don't want to take the time. Two, they like that ability, and there is clinical need in some aspect. We've got to figure out a better way of doing it, but the reason behind it is, okay, well, I now have the same username and password when you call in for support, and I can get into that system right now to fix it. Biomed teams who are in charge of the medical devices typically aren't integrated with information technology. There hasn't been great collaboration. This is starting to change, and that will improve things, but historically it hasn't been there. So is AppSec a problem? Well, this is, how much information am I going to share here? Be careful. This is an infusion pump. So can anybody, I don't know if you can read it, this is actually a screenshot out of burp, out of interceptor. Can anyone see like what may be a problem here? Oh, no. No, so the issues here is when you're going through down at the bottom, you can see it's a post request. You can see there's no session management. Two, what was interesting here, this is just one screenshot, I'll explain the other screenshots. The first thing that I noticed on this infusion pump when you went in, it did use WPA2 encryption, which is actually pretty good. Some of these infusion pumps still only use web. So this one I was like, okay, awesome, it uses WPA2. Well, there's hard-coded creds, went in, intercepted this, and I couldn't grab that WPA2 key to compromise the internal network. But I said, what if I just hit save? Will the application actually check to make sure you changed variables in that WPA2 key field, or will it resubmit everything? So that's what this is it resubmits everything, and up here, these are actually whited out, but you can see the identity, the SSID, and you can see the WPA2 password. Then you can take over the entire hospital's internal network. In addition, what these do is because they don't use session management, when you go in and you grab the actual post commands, I've been able to automate and take these types of infusion pumps and send a post command to that, reprogram it to switch them all over to the rogue access point that's bridged over the internal network, man in the middle everything. You can intercept drug library updates from these. So drug library updates are what set the proper safe upper and lower dosing limits on infusion pumps. And so if you can alter drug libraries, you can cause bad things to happen. And they're managed by a centralized management server that pushes those drug libraries. So once you get the man in the middle, you can intercept those and start doing some bad things with them. So AppSec's definitely a problem. Even outside of encryption, they don't do things like session IDs that would control some of this. All right, so now I'm going to talk finally, before I go to questions, a case study. This is to provide an example of how a hacker or someone that wanted to get into a medical device, or even a security researcher, would kind of threat model and look at these devices and try to find out ways in and vulnerabilities. This happened to be when we were doing the internet-facing research. We found these Zoll defibs that were online and they were on cellular, and so you can see they were on Verizon. These defibrillators are like other manufacturers as well. Philips has a model. And they're external, and they sit inside of the ambulance. And they have a 12-lead read that goes out over cellular connectivity and sends it back to a web service at the healthcare organization in order to get all of that 12-lead read to the receiving emergency department prior to that patient arriving, so that they have that information at their fingertips. Well, here they are, public internet access. Now, I can tell you this, you can see it's the X series web interface. When you go to that web interface, I don't have the screenshot in here today, but when you go there, it says, oh, you need to have a certificate. Well, guess what? Right under you need to have a certificate is the link to download the PEM file. Awesome. So, what do you do as a researcher to threat model this? Well, let's go get some documentation, some service and technician documentation, and figure out, how this thing operates. Well, they have the sales pitch, All right, we're first to market with wireless and Bluetooth, and we have cellular modem connectivity. This is awesome. No, really, it's not. But so we look at that. We're like, wow, there's a really big attack vector, right? They can't figure out one way to do remote communication. They just throw everything in the stack. So how do we override these types of systems? Well, it tells us in the documentation that you need to go ahead and, if you have remote access, yes, you're supposed to do it with USB. If you have remote access, though, it tells us that this is the specific file that you need to change in this defibrillator to alter the configuration on the device. So you have to do this. Well, how do we do that? If you go further into the documentation, it actually explains parameter by parameter every single default value and every acceptable value. So how do you switch it from pediatric mode to adult mode? How do you change it to deliver initially 80 joules instead of the default 10 joules when it does a rescue shock? All of those tells you detail by detail how to do it and what those parameters are in this file. So then as an attacker, you would have to say, okay, well, I have that information. I figured this out. How do I do it? Well, you got to get in the supervisor menu. Here's how you do it. Okay, great. You have to put in a 4-digit supervisor passcode. 1, 2, 3, 4. So outside of that, as an attacker, you do this. You want to clean up your trail. What's the default? User confirmation to clear the logs. Yeah, please, clear them. Done. Oh, well, okay, we're going to be secure. We're going to put the passcode. What's that passcode go to? 1, 2, 3, 4. So this kind of shows you that you don't necessarily even need, and when we do research and start looking at documentation, it's not until the very latter phases, unless we're specifically doing a pen test on a specific device. But if we're doing research, we do these types of things and threat profile this. And now we say, okay, we know the exposure, and we almost certainly know our attack plan and how we can get in. And 80 or 90% of the time, after you've done that, you get your hands on the device, you're successful already. So was this a problem with just one of their lines of defibrillators? No. Here's the rest of their lines of defibs and the supervisor and tech codes. So they used 1, 2, 3, 4 on their latest, was the X series. These are their other 3 models that Zoll makes for these external defibrillators. It's 8 zeros to get admin rights into all of their systems. This top 2, these are the CVs associated. Like I said, I presented that at DefCon, so those are the CVEs that were associated with those. You'll actually notice, if you follow CVEs, like, oh, why is it 2007, why is it 2013? Because part of that supporting evidence that was supplied was the actual service and technician manuals that was the year that they were produced in. And so we retrovert CVEs back to the earliest known publication of that. It's another one, CareFusion Pyxis supply station that was recent. This was done by Billy Rios, another security researcher. And this was default SA credentials, override these types of systems. Pyxis supply stations really, they're med dispense cabinets that sit like at a nursing station, have a bunch of drugs in them, have default credentials, have remote access. You can get into them, get them to spit out drugs and all kinds of fun stuff if you're a drug addict. I'm not. Eric is. So what's some guidance? We have started making some progress in the industry. We have gotten to this awareness stage and how do we tackle it. And the FDA has released guidance for industry, and they just released, not regulatory requirements, but they did release guidance for pre-market submissions that's for the manufacturer to kind of implement some of these basic security hygiene items. It's actually pretty good. It's not a regulatory requirement, it's more guidance. So it's not getting them there, but it's definitely progression. We at least need to raise the bar because right now, security is poor. If someone doped up on morphine can figure out how to hack into their own infusion pump, security really sucks, right? So there's some workshops that happen too. So there's a big FDA workshop I took part of that was back in November out in DC, and this is kind of like a collaboration of industry, security researchers, medical device manufacturers, as well as folks from DHS, FBI were all there. And then there was this building code you can check out. The building code was an initiative that worked on with IEEE and NSF out of George Washington Cybersecurity Initiative. And this was the concept of taking a kind of like a home, like a building code approach of what can you do during engineering and what can we check off and inspect to make sure that security was embedded by design in these types of products. So it's new. It's something I don't think, it's not going to be adapted in the next 2 years, but it's good to, keep those things moving so that as we progress, we can hopefully get caught up. We're not going to go, a lot of people think, man, we've solved all these problems in, other markets, in retail and finance. So shouldn't we just be able to get from 0 to 60 tomorrow? It's not going to happen. And the best we can hope for is kind of increasing our 0 to 60 time from lessons learned. We don't know all the answers right now. There's those unique challenges, right? But one thing that we do know we know what doesn't work. And so we've got to do something that we know hasn't failed previously. And eventually we're going to come up with better solutions for these things and come up in instances where when these devices do fail, they fail safe. So that's all I have. There's my contact, my Twitter. Any questions? Eric was going to come up here and set up all this crap on the table, but I guess he left. He went to go find his drug dealer. Any questions at all? Nobody? In the way back here. So the question is, are we finding workstations or are we finding the actual embedded devices? It's a combination of both. So like an infusion pump, that's all integrated, embedded, right? Everything's on there. And then there is centralized still like server architecture that pushes like drug libraries and those types of things. So the CT scanners, MRI systems, how those typically work is there is like the rad tech has their workstation and they sit behind their little enclosure to not get the radiation. They have some fail-safe options that are actually really good for like MRI and CT. And you go into the application and you put everything in and you hit the button. And it uses web service, which is bad security, and it uses web services and actually dumps like XML files to a local workstation that's directly attached to like the CT scanner or the MRI system. And then there's like the Staples Easy button. So even though it's sitting out there on the remote web server that's directly talking to the CT scanner or something like that, you actually have a physical control that's almost like a CAN bus that goes directly back into the system, and you actually have to hit that to execute it. So what we found is, yes, those XML files, those types of things can be altered. So like dosage levels or like values of where it's going to take the image, those types of things can be altered in XML files, but you would have to alter it and then get someone to actually hit that button at the same time in order to cause. So realistically, it's probably not the biggest threat out there, but it's both devices. And then we're getting into, mobile. You can come up, Eric, by the way. Mobile and digital health. And so that's another thing. And data integrity. So I'm doing some research now on a couple devices just from a data integrity aspect of we've been able to, one, make devices do things they're not supposed to, and then two, their intended use is to dump into the medical record. So altering that data, or they're not using encryption so we can post fake data from these devices down into the medical record, which would probably result in, there's been a lot of research on medical identity theft, someone presenting as you, and misdiagnosis, mistreatment, being prescribed the wrong drug, those types of things. So it's definitely a combination. It's an entire ecosystem when you think of medical devices, and it can be any one of those points that fails that allows you access to the actual physical device itself. Yes? So the question was, am I seeing malware in the wild that's specifically targeting medical devices? I don't think anyone's done enough research on it. I can tell you some of the research that you don't need it, so why waste your time? 1, 2, 3, 4, but jing. But I can tell you, we don't have enough statistics. So forensic capabilities on these devices are very lacking. So it's really hard to get the information. So like a medical device malfunction right now, all we know is once a medical device adverse patient safety event or death is reported, it goes to the FDA. They try to adjudicate it. And they say, okay, this is a clinical cause of death, not the medical device. And then we end up with this bucket of several 100,000 per year of what's in a generic bucket called medical device malfunction. But we don't know. It's never adjudicated to see if it was like a cyber attack or anything intended or unintentional, or was it malware, those types of things. So I've started some research just to kind of prove out to start looking at the intentional versus the unintentional. We do know these devices, they get configured, they get other malware because they're, Windows XP systems, those types of things, or they're, some flavor of Linux. But I haven't specifically seen targeted malware. The FBI, when the community health systems thing, that was really interesting. So most people, what they recognized with the community health system breach was 4.5 million patient records were stolen. What I seen was, this is the first time the FBI has actually told us that they specifically targeted medical devices in their infrastructure. That was more for an intellectual property thing. We also seen that with Medtronic, St. Jude, Boston Children's about a year ago. Their actual internal network got breached, got control of stuff to get intellectual property stuff. And there's a big push in China for med tech because they're importing everything, and so they're looking for that intellectual property in order to replicate that, so they don't need to import a lot of that big nerd tech stuff. There are now, there actually are zero-day exploit kits in the wild, not specifically towards medical devices, but for medical records. So I had an email maybe 3 months ago to buy O-day exploits in the wild. It was like 30 O-days for medical record software. So, does that answer your question? Okay. Anything else? All right. Well, thank you all. If you have any questions, just let me know.